Hey everyone, welcome to Generative Now. I am Michael Mignano. I'm a partner at Lightspeed. AI is changing the economics of the internet. Without a major paradigm shift, the free ad-supported internet that has thrived for nearly 3 decades may come to an end. And so this week, I'm sitting down with Toshit Panigrahi, CEO and co-founder of TollBit, a company that promises to be that shift. TollBit allows publishers and quality content creators to automatically set up licensing deals with AI companies in order to ensure that creators are paid for their work. The company recently announced a $24 million Series A, actually led by us at Lightspeed. And so I sat down to talk to Toshit about why publishers should think of themselves as a source of data, who are the winners and losers in this new economic structure, and how they determine the value of content. Take a listen to this conversation with Toshit Panigrahi. Hey, Toshit.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Thanks for doing this. I know you've had a busy couple of weeks. Congrats on the Series A raise.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for having me too.
Yeah, of course. It's definitely been fun to get to know you and the team. But always fun to have a conversation live for the rest of the world to hear. And thought it'd be fun to talk about TollBit. Obviously, you know, you and the team are coming off the heels of a Series A fundraise, which, you know, for the audience that isn't aware, which we at Lightspeed led. Obviously, very, very excited about that. But it feels like, you know, perfect time to talk about what's going on and dig into the sort of nuts and bolts of kind of the future of AI and content and publishers and maybe the fate of the open web more broadly. Maybe before we do that, for the audience's sake, I think it'd be awesome for people to hear your story. It's pretty incredible. It's pretty inspiring. You know, how you got to TollBit, what you did before that with Toast. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
I started at Toast, I want to say like 10 years ago, right? I joined as, you know, one of the first designers, made the jump over to software engineering. And then I was, I think, employee number 30 over there. And so I got to see that roller coaster, right, in the Boston ecosystem happen. That was quite a wild ride. Got to build and lead some of their consumer-facing applications, so their food ordering apps, you know, ordering at the table, you know, those sorts of products. And then for the last 3 years of my time at Toast, I was heading up an advertising business, right? So it was a retail ad network, right? It had, you know, with closed loop measurement. And the reason we did that was because of third-party cookie deprecation, right? And Toast obviously has a lot of first-party data. So I was heading up that business, and it was around spring of 2023, GPT-4 had just come out, right? And GPT-4 was the first time one of these, you know, LLMs was connected to the internet. It didn't have a knowledge cutoff, right? If you remember that, there was a big deal around that.
Oh, yeah, connected to Bing, right? That was like a big deal when they partnered with Bing. Yeah.
Right. And so when you asked questions to the ChatGPT, it could now go out because of Bing, connect to the internet, go access content. And it was in that spring of 23 that we started seeing something. You know, I was just doing some ancillary research, right? You know, my brother's in college at Purdue. So I was just doing research with ChatGPT, and I was like, I wonder how this changes things, right? So I was doing, you know, Googling, hey, what is rent like in West Lafayette, Indiana? What is housing like in West Lafayette? And the most astonishing thing was happening on ChatGPT, because it was saying, you know, this is the query I'm doing, searching, you know, rent prices near Purdue, searching rent prices near real estate near Lafayette, right? And it would then access Realtor.com. It was accessing Zillow. It was accessing Apartments.com, you know, reading page 1 of 5, reading page 2 of 5. And that was the moment, I think I called up Martin, who would become our CTO, and Olivia, who would become my co-founder. And I was sort of like in a frenzy, and we were like, wait a second. We thought it was trained on a lot of things, but when you ask it questions, you know, that are sort of, that are changing, dynamic, that it might not be an expert on, it goes out and fetches content, live, scrapes sites. So it didn't matter how much content this thing was trained on. It still needed to go out and fetch content. Now, today, fast forward, a year and a half later, we know that's called retrieval augmented generation or grounding. But I think that was one of the first moments we realized that it didn't matter how much content these models were trained on. they still need access to real-time information.
Maybe taking a step back, when I think of Toast, I think of paying for my bill at a restaurant, right, through my phone or something like that. And I think they have lots of other products and tools that are maybe more for like the back office of restaurants. But tell us, what does it mean to be an ads business for Toast? You said you were building an ads business for Toast. Like, I don't think of advertising when I think of Toast.
That's a good thing.
Yeah,
that means it's working.
Yeah.
So it was actually very subtle how we did this, right? Like I said, a lot of my background at Toast was building consumer products, right? So they're food ordering apps. Scan to pay. If you ever scanned a QR code at a restaurant to pay your check, right? That was actually a product Olivia and I built together, and we took to GA. If you've ever scanned a QR code to go order your food, right? So what we did was we revisited a lot of these surfaces, and we said, well, let's try to start an ads business here by influencing consumer behavior in some way. What can we show them to influence behavior? And one of the most natural things that we could have done, right? That just fits right into the experience. You're on the Toast Takeout food ordering app, and you're on the checkout screen, and we were partnering with folks like, American Express or Apple, right? Where we could show you an ad and say, hey, you could get $10 in Toast Cash if you use your American Express, for example, right? Or set up Apple Pay and get, $5 off your next meal, right? And so we would try to nudge consumer behavior by showing them these very contextual ads, right? I think one of my favorite ones is there's a guest-facing display that some bakeries might have. And we turned that into a very subtle ad placement because it has, for example, a phone with Google Pay on it tapping the card reader, and we're trying to nudge you to use Google Pay there, right? So we're promoting Google Pay there. So it's very in context. It's you're looking at a menu. We surface the certain beverage at the top, for example, right? Things that fit in and make sense in the experience so that it's not intrusive, so it might not register as an ad.
Got it. So, okay, fascinating. So Toast has all these different services, which, when building ad products, it sounds like those are impressions in your mind, right? Impressions of potential impressions of an ad to put in front of a human being. Now, fast forward to GPT-4, and you've connected to the internet, and you're seeing that GPT-4 is out there going to these websites for you. Light bulb moment, you think to yourself, wow, that's a lot fewer impressions that would normally be delivered to me, a human. They're now being delivered to ChatGPT, to OpenAI. Was that sort of the thing that you called up Martin and Olivia about?
Yes, and this is where we said, I think the question I was asking them was, hey guys, if this is the future, right? Let's suspend disbelief for a second. Again, it had just come out. There is, the public reception it's not clear at the moment. The developer reception is not clear. The APIs don't exist. We looked at that and we said, the case I was making was like, if this is the future, right? Let's extrapolate for a second. If this is the future, we might not need to visit a website. All of the information I need can be brought to me by these AI applications. And, we have friends who are, at Anthropic. We have friends who are at, Google, right? And we know that we called them up and they told us that new tools are about to be coming out by all of these other companies as well. And so we thought, wait a second. It seems like, this retrieval piece, this RAG piece is not going to go away. We didn't have a name for it at the time, right? So we just called it web scraping. This web scraping wasn't going to go away. And I think what we realized was that this was a different flavor of web scraping, right? Than, I think we're familiar with web scraping. And when you think of that, you really think of that as the domain of white collar professionals in select roles. Maybe, think data science, business intelligence, maybe computer science, and you needed specialized tools to do it. What happens when anyone with access to the internet can just search on one of these online connected LLM tools, right? And fetch answers, right? And the answers are just brought to them. This is actually a lot of the debate around AI overviews in Google right now. What happens when every single Google query can just be reduced to, a blue box at the top, right? Or, take your pick of any search provider that's doing this.
Yeah, I just had this happen to me, actually. It was kind of startling. I was speaking with somebody and they were asking me about a topic that I had previously written a blog post about. And so I just went to Google and Googled the title of the blog post, and it's called the Standards Innovation Paradox. It's a sort of like term I defined for product development and building on standards. And it was so funny. Google just explained, like through the AI answers, it just explained the paradox, like the actual definition that I had created. And I was like, wait a minute, where's my link? Like the link is gone. Google has just co-opted the content. So yeah, this just happened to me. I think you're so right. Like this is happening in real time and sort of like actively, and I'm sure increasingly disintermediating publishers of content with human beings that want to consume it.
So let's take that a step further, right? So we thought about, you thought about this in GPT-4 just comes out, we're having this conversation, right? And now you can begin to see, you close a loop with advertising, right? And then we realize what's at stake. Because if you think about how the internet monetizes, right? It's largely through advertising, right? What happens when you suddenly can't do that anymore, right? What is the incentive to create content anymore? That starts disappearing. That's when we realize, wait, there's actually a big business to be made here. Now, there was a pause though, right? Between when we started TollBit in April, right? Because I think at that time in April, it still wasn't clear how the world was going to shake out. It wasn't clear if GPT-4 was going to take out, it's silly in hindsight, but it wasn't clear if it was just going to be, this explosive success. And Martin also rightly had thoughts about this. Is this going to be available via an API? What is this actually going to look like at implementation, right? What is the competitive landscape going to look like, right? With other AI companies coming up with similar tools. There were too many unknowns in April to say, well, where do you even create a business, right, out of this? Like, the problem is clear, but imagine going to realtor.com and saying, hey guys, like, this thing that just came out is starting to scrape your content. You should try to, pay attention. It was just way too early to be thinking about that.
And that's like kind of the initial, I think, opportunity for TollBit, right? And maybe that was the thing you first started building to basically block that traffic. Is that the initial idea? It was like, hey, let's like first just stop this or at least slow it down.
So I think where it clicked for everyone suddenly of where you make a business out of this was exactly where you said, let's fast forward a few months, right? 1 year ago, right? October of last year. Like you had seen enough of these headlines about, the News Media Alliance is upset and Medium is upset over AI training on their content, right? Or New York Times is now going to sue OpenAI. And that was actually the moment, because of the thinking we had done months prior, that was the moment where we said, wait a second, remember that problem we were talking about web scraping? This is the first symptom of that problem. This is the first industry that is feeling that problem now, right? And we looked at that and said, yes, they're talking about a lot of the discourse was around fair use and copyright infringement and IP theft, but it was a monetization issue. We knew that, right? The question was, if that happens, if everyone's allowed to disintermediate them from their visitors, people don't need to visit websites, how does anyone make money? And that's where we said, this is the entry point to the market. And it was very interesting because, one of the things that we think about quite frequently as we work with, we work with publishers quite a bit, to your point, right? First blocking and analyzing and showing you what that traffic looks like, right? And I think it was exciting because in many ways, if you look at disruptive technologies, disruptions in distribution that have happened over the years, right? You think about the transition from print to radio, from radio to TV, from TV to the internet, right? Internet to, social and mobile, right? Publishers were in many ways the first to raise the alarms about major disruptions in tech, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I think when we first met, I think the first conversation we had was, this is not just a publisher problem, this is a internet-wide problem. This was a disruption in distribution, and publishers were simply the first to raise the alarms. And if we can figure out the new business of the future, that's a big opportunity.
Yeah, publishers I think are definitely the canary in the coal mine here, right? And they're probably going to be the ones to have their businesses disrupted the quickest because the monetization happens sort of at the application layer, right? At the presentation layer, right? Like literally when I'm viewing this website. But if you think about maybe like going a layer down and thinking about the data or the services that some of these companies provide, to me that feels like that's almost like one of the next dominoes to fall. Like to go back to realtor.com, I don't know, I'm guessing they have all this data around real estate listings and real-time, market intelligence around home prices and mortgages and whatever. How do they protect that information? Or how do they, maybe to flip it, where's the opportunity in that information for them to potentially monetize it in a new way, not at the presentation layer? I'm guessing that's kind of what you're talking about now, is like what comes next after this, after publishers.
I think there's an entire vertical after publishers, but I think that's sort of the new tech that we're building at TollBit, right? How do you start making this data and content available at scale, right? Because what you're actually touching on is, if you look at this as a macro trend, and you try to, if you look at those headlines, you look at that realization, you take a step back and you think, well, what is really happening in the industry right now, right? What is everyone up in arms about? If you think about what LLM technology really unlocked, right? It's this ability to process unstructured information or semi-structured information in a way that's not bounded by human capital. It's a fancy way of saying that our ability to process information is about to explode, right? Because for almost all, if you needed to do this before, it was almost always you required a human in the loop.
A human, yeah.
Right? You don't need that anymore, right?
Right.
If I want to just get an answer about any topic, I can ask that on ChatGPT or SearchGPT or u.com, and I can get that answer, and it knows how to make sense of the data and information it's looking at. We can just throw processing power to synthesize information. And that was where we saw the opportunity to say that our ability to access and process information was about to explode. And there's no rails for that.
So how do you go and actually execute on this? Like, what you're describing is basically a new type of market, right? Where it's not just about publishers and advertisers. It's about publishers of content and effectively buyers of that content, right? In this case, like OpenAI being a buyer, a supplier of content, a buyer of content. Suppliers or publishers in this case. Maybe starting on the supply side, like, how do you go and do this? There are probably, billions of websites on the internet. Like, how do you go and protect that data as a first, that information as a first step?
Yeah. So when we talk about publishers, I think the first folks that we talked to were largely digital media publishers, right? Think of all the digital news sites on the planet that are generating content, doing fantastic reporting, producing content on a daily basis. That's the place we started first, right? We didn't go to to your point earlier, right? Sites like, if you think about Realtor.com or Car Gurus or AutoTrader, they're a little bit more removed from the problem because they have a little bit more of a technical moat and Michael, you said this exactly right before, right? For most news sites, for example, right? Content publishers, you have it right there. You have it on the page. It's a read-only interface, we call it, right? Versus some of these other more technical sites like for example, Realtor or AutoTrader, there's a read and write component. You have to take actions. You have to interact with the page to get more information, right? So they have a little bit more of a moat before this disruption reaches them, but it's coming for them. So publishers where we start today are definitely the sort of news sites, the places you go to get your content information.
Okay. So how do you go and do this? So you show them the information.
Right. We have to show them the magnitude of the problem.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is where we set up TollBit Analytics, and we were able to show them that, these AI crawlers were coming and accessing, scraping their site sometimes thousands of times a day, running up their server costs, right?
It's literally costing them money. It's not only like taking away revenue, it's costing them expense.
Absolutely. Right. And I think that was startling to them, right? Because in some cases they thought that they might have been blocking these bots on that robots.txt file, and that actually wasn't true, right? There are new companies coming out with new crawlers all the time. Old crawlers are changing, updating their names and still coming and accessing the content. And this is where we said that it was actually important for two reasons. I think on a positive side, it started, these are analytics tools like that, like TollBit Analytics. We essentially called it the Google Analytics of AI bot traffic, right? Olivia likes calling it that, which I think is a neat name because one of the things that it did was it started showing publishers how to inform content strategy, perhaps, in this new world, which was, I think, the most fascinating thing for me, right? What kinds of articles are getting picked up more than other articles on a daily basis? How soon after you publish an article does it start showing up in one of these systems, right? And I think that was an interesting learning. And the second thing that came out of it was when publishers realized that, folks might be still accessing their content, like I said, thousands of times a day. I think that showed them that it didn't matter how much content you were trained on. It showed that there was still value and value to be captured in that ongoing access to that content.
Right. And who's accessing it? I mean, it's the ChatGPTs of the world, Perplexities, Googles. I mean,
it's every single AI application out there, right? Like if you think about, as the other macro trend that we're seeing is, there's this sort of thing that we talk about in the tech industry that, in 5 years, every company needs to be an AI company, right? whether it's for just productivity gains or because you have to integrate into your products, right? Let's think about a great example of this is I mentioned my background was at Toast, and setting up that ads business, right, and the potential disruption. Olivia was at Fair Market, right, a procurement automation company. And she, when I described this problem, she was like, oh yeah, I know this, because she was actually building automation tools, right, on top of GPT that was going out and scraping vendor and supplier information from the web. Right. And so you start thinking about this and you're thinking like, wait a second, this, if you think about it through the lens of our ability to process information is about to explode, every company out there is going to be embedding, these sort of automation products into their organizations.
So I think the point you're making is like every company is going to be crawling the web for AI bots, right? Like every company is going to be doing this. And in many cases, every person might be doing this in the future, right? Like you're going to be you as a human being, you're going to be getting leverage out of AI to do things for you. It might be help me find a house, right? With the realtor.com example. It might be help me book some travel, right? It might be help me do some research for this work assignment. I don't know. So there could be billions of these things running around the internet at any given moment.
My favorite examples I like using on calls with publishers is you pull up any one of these tools and you ask them, let's observe the difference between a human and one of these AI applications, right? Humans, we will Google something. We will click that first link. We'll click that second link. And then what happens? We get bored and we move on to the next thing, right? SEO is super important in that world. Now, use any of these AI applications and they will go out and they will read 10, 20 articles if they have to answer your question, right? They are these incredible processors of information.
Yeah. So the analytics is kind of the wedge. You go to the publishers, you go to these news media websites, you say, hey, let's show you how this works. How do you go from there to then now, throttling this AI traffic or even charging for it?
Yeah. So this is where now, we set up really what we get excited about at TollBit, right? Which is we call it the Bot Paywall. Right. So it is a way for, publishers install our SDK, install us on their platform, and give anyone who's trying to scrape their content a way to actually pay them for it. Right. We call it a way to have an autonomous exchange of value. Right. But all it is a fancy way of saying it allows someone, a developer, to sign up and pay for the disintermediation they might be causing. Right. Mm-hmm. And compensate that publisher in some way. Right. In a way that doesn't require a one-on-one deal. Because one of the most startling things that has happened over and over again is, as we talk to these AI companies, it's not that there's an unwillingness to pay. There is an unwillingness to maybe do partnerships, because partnerships are actually a very human-intensive, protracted, one-on-one conversation with a lot of, cost and legal effort that people go back and forth on, right? And what we need is actually a framework that allows a frictionless exchange of value. That is actually what we're unlocking. Because if we can do that, we think that the rate at which we can consume information and information is shared will actually explode.
Got it. So, I think what you're saying though is they're not going to pay because of a legal construct or a legal framework. It's really a market-driven motivation. If a publisher can block their content and can monetize their content, they will do that, right? Rather than just giving it away for free, especially if they're foregoing advertising revenue due to the disintermediation. Is that how you think about it? Or are you trying to lean on a legal framework?
No, I think we have to lean on market dynamics, right? We don't want to lean on regulation, and regulation is going to be too diverse and it'll take some time to catch up. I think if you look at what Elizabeth Warren has been pushing for recently, right, with investigating summarization, for example, right? It might be the first time someone's talked about at inference time, we need to examine these AI tools and should we regulate it, right? So we think regulation is going to take too long. We have to instead rely on market dynamics first to solve interesting problems. And, one of the things that we tell publishers when we meet with them is what we're doing with you, right? What TollBit does with you is turn you from a content house to a supplier of data. that's how you should be thinking about yourself, because that's how these AI companies are thinking of you.
How do you do, it strikes me that only today, I guess like only probably the biggest companies are paying for this content, right? OpenAI, you hear about some of these deals, you see them in the news. OpenAI does deal with Hearst, but I imagine most AI companies are not yet paying for content in this way. How do you handle that sort of chicken and egg problem where you want to go get a publisher signed up, you want them to do this work to integrate TollBit, get them on board with this future, but the future hasn't really arrived yet, right? Like, how do you just like manage expectations and get people actually willing to engage in this future before it actually shows up?
So we have to solve problems for folks where they're having it today, right? So, I mean, we've talked to enough AI companies that we sort of are starting to, there's patterns that emerge, right, of problems that they need solving. Even on the licensing side, right? So even the ones who are doing licensing, right? It is increasingly becoming tricky, and there's regulation, for example, across the world that you have to stay ahead of, right? There's problems we solve for them on that front. There are, for example, existing licensing deals that need help, right? Because this world that's emerging is so new, right? There's a lot of problems that we found that we're solving for on the licensing side, even between deals that are being struck by an AI company and a publisher, right? TollBit's actually the licensing infrastructure for a handful of them, right? Because like we said, we get the publisher thinking about themselves as a source of data, not just content. The other side is we have to solve and get data for them, for AI companies, that is actually harder to get, right? For example, we're working with an AI company right now for the upcoming election, right? And we are their source of data. And this is where election data and content is flowing through the TollBit platform for this AI company to use, right? And they didn't have to do a one-on-one deal, a one-off deal with this publisher.
That's really interesting. So they're looking for election data, and that's sort of like a timely thing, right? It may not be data that they need post the election. Rather than invest all this effort to like spin up these deals, do a partnership on their own manually, they can just like turn on TollBit for, whatever, a 3-month period or less, I guess. They just get it. They just get the data.
Exactly.
That's really, really cool. Let's play this forward a little bit. Like, how does this all shake out? I mean, you said it earlier in the conversation. I mean, in this future, like, what is the incentive for you to make content if you're just going to get disintermediated by the Googles and the OpenAIs of the world? Like, it almost leads to like a new economic structure of the internet, right? Both in terms of like the winners and losers, like what does the distribution curve look like between the different players? And also like, what are you creating as a supplier, as a publisher? Like, do websites even matter in this future? Or are we just basically, coming up with some way to distribute the data to the AI agents?
There's so much to unpack in that question. And I think
sorry.
some of that, oh no, we'll go through all of it. But I think some of it also it depends on the time horizon we're talking about, right? I think in the short term, there's a lot of conversation, and this is a lot of what we do with publishers as well, right? I think there's a lot of conversation about, I think you mentioned OpenAI and Google, right? A lot of time is spent with them, showing them other examples that are out there, saying that, it's not just the big companies. Like, everyone's coming out with an AI tool. Every Fortune 500 company is building some sort of GPT-powered tool right now, right? And it's like, there's going to be a real long tail that you need to think about. It's not just the big companies that come to mind. I think those are the easiest ones to think of. But then when you show them more nuanced examples, I think it's mind-blowing to them sometimes, right? And then when we think about how this unfolds, right? You asked earlier, like, are we depending on regulation or are you depending on market dynamics, right? What we have seen from especially the biggest AI companies, and I think this has been the thing that gives us the most sort of hope, is that there is an incentive to figure it out, right? On that side. Because if you play this out and there is no incentive to create content, people will just not create content, and content will die. Publishers, that have existed for over 100 years will cease to exist. Local media is already harmed. We actually love working with local media because they have unique content and data that you can't get elsewhere, right? Which is valuable to these AI partners as well, right? Delivering it in a neat, timely manner. So this is where we think that if we don't solve for it, there is a very dystopian future where content creation is not incentivized because there's no way to monetize it, and there's a lot of knock-on effects that happen from there, right? We can be dramatic and say, it is risking freedom of information and democracy itself by doing that, right? So we bet on the fact that the world will not let that outcome happen. And if that doesn't happen, what is the alternative? Which is you need a framework to actually create that value exchange, which is what we're creating.
How will content be valued in this world? How do you value random person's blog post versus story in the New York Times, story on the front page of the New York Times?
So I think that's something we think about a lot at TollBit, right? We also love partnering with researchers, right? So economists, for example, are very taken with this problem, right? Of how do you start valuing content in the market, right? I was talking to this one gentleman about the same problem, and he, back when he was at MIT doing research, he said that one of the things this reminded me of him of a challenge where they were trying to figure out what the value of Wikipedia was. And the way they did this was bringing in various focus groups of individuals, and then asking them how much they would need to pay them for them not to use Wikipedia for the next month.
Oh,
right?
Interesting.
And through this, they were actually able to come out and find what a value of Wikipedia would be, right? Now, the reason I say this is because I think there's been a lot of academic thinking about this space in different terms, right? Maybe not in exactly the TollBit terms, but we see this fascination from academia to actually try to figure out and answer some of this problem. There's also a supply and demand dynamic to it, right? I think I mentioned local news earlier, right? Local news actually has a lot of unique content that no one else is writing about. That should command a premium. So uniqueness will definitely be a factor into that algorithm as well. And of course, demand, right? If suddenly something happens and Tiger King is blowing up, and there's only one news station in Oklahoma writing about this, that content is suddenly more valuable.
Yeah, I guess the content that is most valuable is the content that is most in demand, but also the most unique, right? Like thinking back to my question about the New York Times. Now that I'm thinking about it a little more, that may actually not be the most valuable content, because the moment it's published, there are going to be 10 other sources covering the same exact story. An AI agent may not value the original source the way maybe we value it today, or maybe it will, because maybe immediacy is what's most important, depending on what whatever this AI agent does and the value that it brings to the user.
So you brought up another two factors: immediacy. So there might be more value to be captured in the first, if you break that story, right, in that first hour, right? Then the rest of the market will capture from it. Or it could also be, you mentioned the other thing, which is brand equity. That New York Times brand actually has value that it imparts on that content as well. The user might ask directly, hey, what does New York Times think about this? Right? Or give me the updates of the election from the New York Times, for example, in which case you have no choice.
So we talked a little bit about the first layer, and we're talking a lot about now around sort of the economics of content, but take us a layer deeper. What does this look like when we start going below content? We start getting into data, or actually, the performing of a service. What can TollBit do for that that layer down of the internet, and sort of how it exists today versus how it's going to exist in the future when my agent, wants to go out and book a trip on my behalf?
I think one of the most exciting initiatives that, we're working on at TollBit, obviously there's the enterprise side of TollBit, right? We work with publishers, we help them prepare and help them with these licensing deals. We help these AI companies stay above board with regulation and managing these deals. If you look at what's interesting in AI right now, it's around agents. How do you unlock agents? Right now, I know there's been, a lot of hype around agents in the workplace, right? And I think the reason for that is because it's in some ways low-hanging fruit. Because you can deploy an AI agent for automation within your firewall, say, of your company, right? And it can have access to whatever data it needs, right? Obviously Glean is doing some fantastic things in that space. And it can automate things by using your internal APIs. But where the big unlock for agents will happen, right, is when they can go out beyond the confines of that one space, right? And I think what we're excited about at TollBit and what we actively think about unlocking is how do you make agents useful beyond just this work use case, right? I'm going to geek out for a second, right? But like,
Sure, please.
one of the things that we think about is, and we get excited about, is that we 100% think like, you remember Jarvis from Iron Man?
Of course, yeah.
We think Jarvis should exist. There's no reason it shouldn't exist, right? But if you think about that, and in fact, when we were first raising our pre-seed for TollBit, that was a slide that we had, was the UI from Jarvis. And we pointed out and we said, to power this UI, you need content from LAX.com for the flight landings. You need content from Flight Radar 24 for where the flights are in the sky. You need content from Audi for the parts of the Audi R8. All of that exists on websites, not accessible by, you can only scrape so much, right?
Right.
So in order to get this information, you actually need a better way to access it, right? You need a way to expose that data better. And that's what, the exciting sort of new frontier that we're building at TollBit. How do you enable AI agents to get access to data that they might have previously had a hard time getting, or to take actions where today the only alternative is spinning up a headless browser and trying to click. And that's not a stable integration by any means.
I don't know how much of this you've shared publicly, but what can you share about like the publishers you're working with today? Just to give people a sense of who's currently using at least the analytics.
Yeah, I think we have over 160, 170 sites across all of our products, right? So we're talking from, Magic Search, so Bot Paywall, to the TollBit analytics tool, right, to the licensing infrastructure. I mean, this goes from, sites that have 500 million monthly active users all the way down to sites that have that are local news sites like the Gazette in Iowa, right? I think where we see this sort of like interesting evolution happening, right? We are bringing to our partners, right, some of the first AI pilots, right? So they might have deals of their own. Obviously, we facilitate that with our infrastructure. But monetization has already started happening on the platform. We have AI companies coming to us, right, that are transacting. I mentioned election content, right? We have another company that is paying for publisher content, right? So as they, you ask the mechanics of how does monetization work, for example, right? So publishers come in, they set their prices, and these AI partners don't need to do one-on-one deals. They don't need to do the negotiation. As they use that content, as we collaborated with, AI companies, with publishers, with folks at the News Media Alliance, for example, right? And came up with an industry-first RAG license, right? A license that lets you summarize, cite, ground on information, right? Everything short of, and the only two things that it doesn't allow are, for example, like full display, because that's just syndication, right? And it doesn't allow foundational model training, right? But this supports that notion that, hey, there's a lot of applications that will need to make use of this content. How do we allow it? How do we create language around that? And we are issuing those licenses. And these AI partners, every time they use that content, summarize that content, cite that content, they pay out to the publishers in our platform.
How do they know what to charge? Like, are you advising them on that? Or are they just picking the rates out of thin air? Like, how does that work?
I think the publishers do some ballpark estimation on their part. We're actually kind of guarded about how we figure out pricing. We give them tools to do it on the platform as well. I think we had talked about some of the inputs that we had talked about earlier, right? Demand, uniqueness, brand equity, things like that. And then, what we're, again, pioneering now is like, how do you move to a programmatic model? How do you move to a world where you can actually adjust that based on supply and demand? Because you don't want there to be an arbitrage either.
Right. It's going to eventually, this eventually becomes like the new form of advertising. It's auction-based, it's real-time, it's dynamic.
Yes.
Assuming you have enough supply and demand on each side.
Yeah.
What about other forms of content? So we're talking a lot about right now about sort of written words, text, right, news, et cetera. But I have to imagine, the entire internet is sort of being ingested by models right now. And so, like, do you imagine a world in which you're also helping generate revenue for publishers of video, of audio, of you name it?
Actually, some pretty cool things. I think we'll have some case studies pretty soon with what we did with I think the election is another good example, right? Because it's not just enough to get the data, right? With the election, you still have to display the results in some way. You still have to show live TV maybe to a user, right? These tools are only as good as, as the UI in certain ways, right? Like you're not going to use ChatGPT to get live election coverage because blobs of text only go so far, right?
Yeah.
You want to be able to see that video, right? So we're actually building interesting distribution mechanisms for publishers to share, that type of content, right? Whether it's watch a video, whether it's, watch election coverage, for example, right? So there's going to be some case studies around the election that are coming out. And I think the other interesting side is we're at least helping unlock a couple interesting, innovative business models too, right? So we have this interesting use case of a publisher that is licensing their video to an AI model provider, right? And actually both parties were sort of, the AI company was ready to take the video as is, right? And the publisher was understandably a little hesitant about it, right? And the model that they were trying to get to was, I will give you the video content, but I'll let you fine tune a specific model on it. And what we're working out and enabling on the platform is allowing them to license out the video to the AI company through us, where the model company now also uses us almost as a ledger to keep count of how much that model is used, how much compute it uses, how many videos it generates, right? How many minutes of videos it generates. And then we can do that rev share back, and we're a neutral third party to that.
That's awesome. That makes so much sense. Really, really smart. If we were to fast forward a couple of years, like, we talked about the premise at the beginning of this conversation about, publishers, visitors of websites, the advertising between, that happens between those two being the thing that funds the content. What are the incentives for content over time? If we were to fast forward, like, what happens to advertising on the internet? Like, what happens to this economic engine that powers the whole thing right now? Like, does it just go away? Does this become the new version of it? What does the future look like 5 to 10 years from now?
So it's interesting, because I think if you were to look at like why we started TollBit in the first place, right? Like, why was it that Olivia and I stumbled on this problem, right? And let's take it back to Toast advertising for a second, right? As an example, why were we able to build that business? We were able to build that business because of third-party cookie deprecation, right? We could actually, and it wasn't unique to Toast. DoorDash did it, Instacart did it, Walmart did it, right? These are retail ad networks, right? We have first-party data. We know what the person is looking at, right? And we can actually track conversion. We know if someone used an Amex card, right? And that data is very valuable, right? We saw this enormous shift in ad spend, right? After Google announced they were deprecating those third-party cookies, and all of these, advertisers now, right? We think of it as it's a zero-sum game, right? In the sense that marketing budgets at the beginning of the year is ad spend at the end of the year, right? It has to go somewhere. And if you can't spend on digital services, digital ads anymore because, or just generic web ads anymore because you can't measure return on ad spend anymore, right? You can't measure ROAS anymore. What happens? You're going to shift that ad budget to a place where you can better measure conversion. And that's what happened with, these retail ad networks, the rise of retail ad networks, right? And in fact, also why Instagram ads, for example, work really well, right? You can actually track pretty well. So what's going to happen here is what we realized was if this is true, if this thesis is true, that website traffic as a macro trend is declining across the board. It has been happening even before AI. As a macro trend, it's a given. Pair that with, for the traffic that is making its way through, right? It's going to become harder and harder to tell apart who is AI and who is human anymore, right? If you keep throwing up cybersecurity walls, the tools to scrape it are simply going to keep getting better and better, and you won't be able to tell them apart, right? And so imagine what happens to the disruption in ad spend when you no longer know whether it's a human on the other side, right? You can't even advertise on websites because there's not even enough impressions, valid impressions to go around. What happens? We think that there's going to be a massive shift in ad spend, right? Might not be going to publishers anymore, might not be going to web advertising anymore. And actually, what we're building is the funnel so that some of that ad spend can make its way back to the publishers, right? We're building the pipelines to share back some of that revenue in some ways.
Yeah. Super fascinating. Toshit, thank you so much. As always, when I talk to you, I learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So really, really appreciate the time.
No, thank you for having me. I'm super excited. We work with the whole entire Lightspeed team.
Yes. Yeah, we're thrilled to be partnering with you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for listening to Generative Now. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review the podcast. That really does help. And if you want to learn more, just follow Lightspeed at LightspeedVP on YouTube, X, or LinkedIn. Generative Now is produced by Lightspeed in partnership with Pod People. I'm Michael Mignano, and we will be back soon. See you then.